How Cornelius Vanderbilt Took Over America's Rails, the Shrewd Strategist Who Built a Shipping Empire. Part 1. America Before Vanderbilt's Rail Empire. Chaos on Water and Land. In the early 1800s, before Cornelius Vanderbilt rose to prominence, the United States faced significant transportation challenges. The country was expanding rapidly, but moving people and goods was slow, expensive, and unreliable. The main options for travel were primitive. Horse and wagon transportation relied on dirt roads that were often muddy and rough, making journeys long and difficult. Sailing ships, used on rivers and along the coast, were dependent on wind and could face days or weeks of delays. Early steamboats, though a new technology, were still dangerous due to frequent boiler explosions. Moreover, they were often controlled by a few powerful companies that charged exorbitant prices, limiting access for many. There was no integrated national rail network, preventing cheap and quick movement across long distances. This chaotic transportation system severely hindered trade and travel. Farmers struggled to get their crops to market. Businesses found it hard to ship goods efficiently, and people faced obstacles moving westward. Anyone who could make travel faster, shipping cheaper, and services more reliable stood to gain a huge advantage. This was the landscape Cornelius Vanderbilt encountered. The root causes of this mess were clear. America was largely rural, with poor infrastructure. Technologies like steamboats and railroads were novel and carried significant risks. Government and private sectors had not yet invested in modern highway or railway networks. In the early 1800s, railroads were almost non-existent. However, by the time Vanderbilt began his major ventures, thousands of miles of rail lines were being laid, and steamboats were beginning to dominate major rivers and coastal routes. The consequences of this inefficient system were widespread. Travel between major cities could take days or even weeks. High shipping costs restricted trade. In areas without competition, a few companies could charge high prices and offer poor service, exploiting the lack of alternatives. Signs of these problems included widespread complaints from farmers and merchants about slow travel and high fares. Newspaper reports frequently covered steamboat accidents and exposed monopolies controlling key routes. Conversely, there was immense excitement every time a new, faster route became available. Part 2. Who was Cornelius Vanderbilt, and what was he trying to fix? Cornelius Vanderbilt was born in 1794 on Staten Island, New York, into a family of modest means. He earned the nickname Commodore due to his extensive work with steamboats. His career began in his teens, running small boats, before he transitioned to steamboats and later to railroads. Vanderbilt had little formal education but possessed an immense drive to work hard, cut costs, and outmaneuver his competitors. He was a relentless businessman. He keenly observed the problems in existing boat companies, noting that they overcharged passengers and often held monopolies on routes. Service quality was generally poor because customers had few choices. Vanderbilt believed he could offer lower prices, run faster and more efficient boats, and thus win over customers from his rivals. Later, he identified similar inefficiencies in the burgeoning railroad industry, such as numerous small, disconnected lines, weak management, and confusing pricing. Vanderbilt's motivation was primarily to make money, gain power, and surpass other businessmen. Yet to achieve these goals, he had to provide real solutions for customers: cheaper, faster, and more reliable transportation. His ambition inadvertently solved critical public needs. Several factors contributed to his rise. America was experiencing huge growth in population, trade, and westward expansion. New technologies, particularly steamboats and railroads, provided fresh opportunities. Vanderbilt's personal traits, aggressive, competitive, and willing to take significant risks and fight hard for deals, perfectly suited this dynamic environment. His growing influence had a profound impact. Smaller competitors were often bought out or simply driven out of business. While customers sometimes benefited from lower prices during price wars, Vanderbilt's dominance eventually led to reduced competition and higher control by larger companies. Newspapers of the era frequently discussed the Commodore, controlling steamboat routes and major railroad lines. Other businessmen often feared or resented him, yet were sometimes forced to collaborate with or sell their assets to him, acknowledging his undeniable power. Part 3. The Steamboat Wars, Beating Monopolies on Water. In the early days, some steamboat companies held government-granted monopoly rights on crucial routes, such as from New York to New Jersey or along parts of the Hudson River. This allowed them to charge high prices, limit competition, and dictate service quality, which ultimately harmed regular passengers and shippers. Steamboats represented the fastest way to travel rivers and coasts, so controlling these routes meant controlling important aspects of trade and travel. Breaking these monopolies would lead to lower prices, increased access, and open up huge business opportunities for new entrants. The problem of monopolies was caused by government decisions granting exclusive operating rights to specific companies. Powerful early steamboat owners leveraged political connections, legal battles, and price controls to maintain their dominance. Vanderbilt's strategy as a young boat operator was direct. He challenged these monopolies by running his boats on protected routes anyway. He offered much lower fares than the established monopolists, sometimes operating at a loss just to lure away customers. He used superior speed, efficiency, and lower profit margins to win market share. This forced the monopolies to either significantly lower their prices, buy them out, or risk losing their grip on the route entirely. In the short term, customers enjoyed cheaper travel, and the power of existing monopolies was weakened. In the long term, Vanderbilt accumulated significant wealth, established a reputation as a formidable competitor, and gained control over key routes. Ultimately, this led to fewer, larger companies dominating, often with Vanderbilt at the helm. People witnessed ticket prices dropping rapidly on routes where Vanderbilt competed. Lawsuits and legal battles over operating rights became common. Newspaper stories frequently reported on aggressive price wars and steamboat races, highlighting the intense competition he instigated. Vanderbilt's steamboat playbook followed a clear step-by-step process. First, he identified routes with high prices controlled by monopolies. Second, he entered those routes with faster or better ships and drastically lower prices, even if initial profits were tiny. Third, he aggressively cut costs to survive on lower fares. Fourth, he forced the monopoly to either match prices, lose profits, or buy them out. Finally, he repeated this strategy on other lucrative routes. This systematic approach built his shipping empire and solidified his reputation as a ruthless strategist. Part 4. From steamboats to railroads, taking over the tracks. By the mid-1800s, railroads were emerging as the superior method for transporting goods and people, gradually replacing steamboats. However, the burgeoning rail industry had its own set of problems. Many lines were small and operated independently. Tracks often did not connect smoothly, causing inefficiencies. Some railway companies were poorly managed or on the verge of bankruptcy. This fragmented system resulted in delays, confusing transfers, and inconsistent pricing and rules across different lines. Railroads were rapidly becoming the backbone of the U.S. economy. Controlling them meant influencing trade, shaping city growth, and impacting entire regions. Vanderbilt astutely recognized that the future of transportation was no longer solely on water, but on rails. The chaos in the railroad sector stemmed from many companies rushing to build lines primarily to acquire land and profit, with little overall coordination. Regulation and oversight were weak, and many companies incurred large debts from rapid construction. Vanderbilt executed a significant shift in his business focus. He sold off much of his steamboat business and began acquiring railroad stocks, shares in the companies themselves. He concentrated on key lines around New York, such as the New York Central and the Hudson River Railroad, along with others that connected major cities. His goal was to merge smaller lines into a cohesive, large system and to control the crucial entry and exit points of New York City. The effects of his actions were transformative. Rail lines under his control became part of a larger, more connected network. Travel from the Midwest to New York became more direct and significantly faster. However, this also led to reduced competition. Vanderbilt gained the power to influence prices and exert pressure on competing lines. Headlines frequently spoke of Vanderbilt's system of railroads. Smaller railroads either merged into his network, were bought out, or struggled to compete against his expanding empire. Vanderbilt's railroad takeover strategy involved several steps. First, he bought stock in key railroads. Second, he gained control of their boards, which are their decision-making bodies. Third, he merged lines to create continuous routes across various regions. Fourth, he standardized operations, including schedules, pricing, and track connections. Finally, he used his dominant position to set shipping terms, strategically adjust rates, and block rivals from accessing favorable connections. Part 5. Ruthless Tactics and the Problem of Monopolies. As Vanderbilt's power grew, new issues emerged concerning his tactics. With fewer competing railroads, some shippers, particularly farmers and small businesses, felt trapped. Large companies like Vanderbilt's could favor certain clients over others and use secret deals or rebates to reward big partners, creating an uneven playing field. This highlighted the risk of monopoly. When a single company or a small group controls a market, it can potentially abuse its power. Railroads were not just private businesses. They were essential infrastructure, comparable to today's internet or power grid. If controlled by a few powerful entities, they could dictate prices, wages, and market access for millions of Americans, sparking public anger and demands for government intervention. This monopolistic power arose from mergers and acquisitions, where companies bought out their rivals. Aggressive tactics, such as undercutting prices until competitors collapsed or denying them key connections, further solidified market control. The lack of strong early laws to prevent such behavior also contributed significantly to the problem. By the late 1800s, a handful of powerful individuals, including Vanderbilt and others who followed, controlled vast stretches of U.S. rail mileage. This concentrated control directly influenced the push for antitrust laws, such as the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, and led to state and federal regulation of railroads. The effects were mixed. On the positive side, integrated and more efficient rail networks emerged, and large companies could invest heavily in infrastructure development. However, small shippers often paid higher rates, and rural areas could be overcharged compared to major customers. This era also saw an increase in political corruption as powerful rail magnates tried to influence lawmakers for their benefit. Signs of public discontent included farmers' groups, like the Grangers, protesting high railroad rates. Newspapers began attacking wealthy industrialists and financiers, labeling them robber barons. There was growing public discussion about trusts, large corporations controlling entire industries. Society's response involved a series of steps. First, public outcry, protests, angry articles, and political speeches raised awareness. Second, government investigations began, with officials studying railroad pricing and practices. Third, regulation was introduced, leading to the creation of the Interstate Commerce Commission, or ICC, in 1887, to regulate railroad rates and practices. Fourth, antitrust laws like the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 were passed, aimed at limiting monopolies and fostering competition. These measures began to curb the power of individuals like Vanderbilt, though much of this significant regulation came after his peak years of empire building. Part 6. What Vanderbilt's story teaches about strategy and power. Now, let's consider what you, as a 10th grader in the U.S., can learn from this historical account. Vanderbilt's story reveals fundamental system-level problems. Early technology markets often lacked clear standards, permitting aggressive behavior and rewarding those willing to take significant risks. There was an initial imbalance between private profit motives and the broader public interest. Vanderbilt stepped in and solved some immediate problems, such as increasing efficiency and, for a time, lowering prices. However, in doing so, he also created new issues, including concentrated power and reduced competition. Understanding this history helps you see how new technologies today, such as social media or the influence of tech giants, can create immense power for certain individuals or companies. These innovations can often outpace regulations for a period. It also illustrates how someone with sharp strategy, a willingness to take risks, and sheer persistence can profoundly shape entire industries. Misinterpretations of Vanderbilt are common. Some narratives portray him as a hero, a tough worker, and a self-made man. Others depict him as a villain, ruthless, and an uncaring builder of monopolies. The reality is more complex. He was a multifaceted figure, part builder, part oppressor, and a significant creator of modern infrastructure. When we evaluate business leaders, we often categorize them simply as geniuses or monsters. It is more valuable, however, to ask, what specific problems did they solve? What new problems did they cause? And what rules might make their industry fairer for everyone? Today, we see modern parallels to Vanderbilt's era. Tech giants control vast segments of social media, search engines, and online shopping. Concerns arise about privacy, market control, and the treatment of workers. Vanderbilt's story provides an early historical example of these very same debates. To think critically about these powerful entities, follow a step-by-step approach. First, when you hear about a powerful person or company, ask, what did they do exceptionally well, and who primarily benefited from their actions? Second, also ask, who was disadvantaged or hurt by their strategies? What specific power did they gain over others? Third, consider the role of rules. What laws or regulations were effective, or where did they fail? What changes could make the system more equitable? Finally, apply this critical thinking to contemporary entities like tech companies, banks, social media platforms, or any major institution that influences your life. Part 7. Final lessons from Vanderbilt's rail and shipping empire. Let's conclude with several key lessons from Vanderbilt's remarkable career. Lesson 1. Real problems create big opportunities. America's early transportation system was deeply flawed. Vanderbilt identified high prices, poor service, and disconnected networks. He combined hard work with astute strategy to offer cheaper, faster services, thereby winning customers. For you, the lesson is to look for genuine problems people face. If you can solve them more effectively than others, you can gain influence and financial success. Lesson 2. Aggressive strategy can build and threaten a system. Vanderbilt built more efficient, larger networks. However, he also employed price wars, hostile takeovers, and harsh tactics against rivals. While this stabilized some aspects of the system, it also concentrated immense power in his hands. For you, strategy is crucial, but how you implement it impacts not just yourself, but everyone connected to your endeavors. Lesson 3. Big infrastructure needs balancing. Railroads in Vanderbilt's time, much like the internet today, are fundamental systems that many people rely on. If controlled by a small number of wealthy players, these systems can be efficient but also potentially unfair. This is precisely why we have regulators, antitrust laws, and public debates. For you, remain aware of who controls the essential roads you travel on, whether they are literal or digital. Lesson 4. Wealth and morality aren't the same thing. While Vanderbilt later donated some money, including to Vanderbilt University, his vast wealth originated from ruthless competition, hard bargaining, and the establishment of monopolistic control. He was undoubtedly hard-driving and brilliant, yet not consistently fair or kind. For you, avoid assuming that wealth equates to either inherent goodness or evil. Instead, focus on examining actions and their true impacts. Lesson 5. Regulation often follows abuse. After Vanderbilt and others exploited market power, harmed smaller players, and ignited public anger, the U.S. government responded. This led to new regulations, such as railroad commissions, and the implementation of antitrust laws. For you, understand that systems evolve. If you observe unfairness, speaking out and organizing can be powerful catalysts for new rules and positive change. Lesson 6. You are part of these systems. You might think this is merely history, irrelevant to your life. However, you constantly rely on systems built by others: roads, the internet, phone networks, and school systems. Soon, you will vote, choose careers, spend money, and perhaps start businesses. Your choices either support or challenge powerful entities, and they ultimately shape future rules and practices. Lesson 7. Ask better questions about power. Whenever you encounter a huge empire, whether it was railroads in Vanderbilt's era, oil in Rockefeller's, computers in Gates's, online retail in Bezos's, or social media today, ask critical questions. What problem did they solve? What structure did they create? Who gained power and who lost it? What rules should be in place to ensure fairness and stability? How Cornelius Vanderbilt took over America's rails is more than just the story of one tough businessman. It is a narrative about a nation grappling with significant transportation challenges, a man who saw opportunities amidst chaos, and the inherent benefits and dangers of allowing private power to control public systems. If you can discern these patterns, both in history and in the contemporary world, you will be better equipped to understand the news, your economy, and your own future. And perhaps one day, you will leverage that understanding to build something substantial yourself, while avoiding past mistakes.